Priesta, he's been the hero in this round for FaZe thus far. He finds another kill. It's Priesta working on the ace to close this out. Scump's hitting through mid-map, doesn't have time to work, but it's FaZe Clan for the first time since the Season 3 playoffs of Advanced Warfare in 2015 are your champions.
Alrighty, what is up, everybody? Welcome to episode 11 of COD Talks. I am your host, Furs95. Tons to get to today. Rostermania is in full effect. We've already had several confirmed rosters already. I'm going to want to start off by just kind of going down the list of the confirmed rosters up to this point. So the major ones, obviously, the first one being Slasher has confirmed to be going to Rise, joining alongside of Gunless, Looney, and TJ. TK has made roster changes as well. They have picked up Methods and Pharaoh alongside Kenny and Accuracy. Envy has confirmed to be picking up Chino and Decimate alongside of Hook and Classic. E-United has confirmed to be picking up Felony alongside of Clay, Arcides, and Pristini. And Evil Geniuses has confirmed to be picking up Silly and Assault alongside of Aches and Apathy. There's a lot of other rosters that are still technically rumored, but they're all but confirmed at this point. I believe Temp to Echo Fox is one of those. There's some other. I think Ricky might be playing alongside or with Lightning Pandas. So there's a bunch of other confirmed, not yet totally confirmed rosters, but all but confirmed at this point. And I'll probably dive into more of those in next week's episode. But for now, I'm just going to stick to these. Just kind of give my initial thoughts on, if this made the team better or worse, all things of that nature. So, first and foremost, just want to start off with Rise. The addition of Slasher. So, I think on paper, this absolutely makes Rise a better team. I mean, Slasher, in my mind, has been the best player in the game up to this point. I think he's just been the most impactful player, in my opinion. His presence, you always feel his presence on the map. He's very versatile. He's a really smart, strong S&D player. His hardpoint game speaks for itself. He's got ridiculous KDs every event, just about every event. I know he didn't play too well at Birmingham, but every other event he's been dealing absolutely off. His CTF game's strong as well. I mean, he's just a guy that I think what Rise, it was kind of a unique situation, right? Because once Slasher announced free agency, that's a huge deal. I mean, he was, like I said, in my mind, he's been the single best player in the game up to this point. And when the best player in the game announces free agency, you got to look at him. I don't care who you are. Even if you're Optic Gaming, you have to at least look at him and think, okay, and at least consider trying to add him to your team, because he's a guy that is so talented. I mean, he's the best player in the game. I mean, I realize, people are going to point out his personality issues, his maybe ego issues, but, and that's true. It's a fair point. I think it's fair criticism of Slasher because, in the past, he has had problems, bashing heads with other players, but ultimately, he's too big a talent to pass up on, and I think that's what Rise ultimately, decided upon, is that, look, we love Methods to death. He's been playing great for us, but Slasher is a really unique talent, and we got to go after him, and I respect that decision, and it's honestly a decision I probably would have made if I were Rise. I know that some people would disagree with that. Some people thought that, they've only had one bad event, and why make the change this early? And ultimately, I think that it just comes down to the simple fact that you can't pass up on an opportunity to pick up the best player in the game. I would say, I guess it's a relatively high risk, high reward, just because of how well Rise has played up to this point, and they've already won an event. They've only been together for a few, and it's like there's only so much better they can get. But I ultimately do think this makes Rise a better team, on paper at least, for sure. Maybe there are going to be personality clashes, but I mean, again, this is a scary lineup. I mean, you just added the best AR in the game, in my opinion. You have the best flex player in the game, and you have two very strong subs in Looney and TJ. So ultimately, again, I just think Rise is a scary team. They were already a scary team, and I think this makes them even more scary, to be honest. So it's gonna be interesting. Particularly, like most people pointed out, the personality clashes between Slasher and mainly Gunless will be interesting. But again, I think that this is, they're two guys that just want to win. And I think that they're too talented I think they'll understand that, they got to put their differences aside and just recognize their talent and what this team is capable of. So I expect big things from this Rise roster. I'm very interested to see how they do throughout the remainder of the World War II season. So with that said, guys, I'm going to move on to TK. So TK's roster, very interesting, very interesting. I think it was a much needed change. I think that ultimately, like I've talked about before, this TK roster, the old one, it just didn't fit the way the meta shifted. They had two main ARs in Chino and Accuracy, and that didn't help their cause. They didn't have a whole lot of sub pressure next to Kenny. Kenny didn't really have much of a duo. Theory just was not pulling his weight in terms of slang. And ultimately, I do think this definitely makes TK a better team. I know Pharaoh is maybe a little bit of a questionable pickup for some people, just because he's still pretty young and largely unproven. But I think he's wildly talented. I think Pharaoh, he reminds me a lot of when TJ Haley was coming up back in AW, and I think it's a I don't know if it's a safe gamble, but I think it's a good gamble to make, because ultimately Pharaoh is a very aggressive, hyper aggro sub that I think is going to go along very well with Kenny. I think him and Kenny could really become a strong SMG duo that we all know is so important in the success in World War II. So I like the Pharaoh pickup, and then Methods, of course, is a great pickup. I think Methods was a guy that, he's been an MVP of a tournament. He's been a T3 AR in my mind up to this point. And he was a guy that, once Rise announced that they were dropping him, he's the guy that you definitely had to look at going after. And TK took advantage of it. And I think it will be interesting to see. I think I've heard rumors that Accuracy is going to be the flex, which is the only sort of question mark in my opinion on this team. I guess Pharaoh's kind of a question mark too, but the biggest question mark I have for this team is Accuracy. How is he going to adapt to the flex role? Because he kind of struggled with it in the past on the old roster. So ultimately, I think that's what this team's success is going to come down to. We talk about time and time again, you really need a strong flex player in order to be successful in World War II. And, Accuracy, like I said, in the past, he kind of struggled with it, but maybe this new roster will sort of change his mindset a little bit. So it'll be interesting. But again, I think TK ultimately did get better as well on paper, and I'm excited to see what we get from them moving on in the World War II season as well. So moving on, next I want to talk about the Envy roster. This is an interesting one. Envy was put in kind of a tough spot with Slasher announcing free agency. And obviously they didn't have him contracted, so they weren't really able to restrict him or anything like that. So it was, Envy kind of had to just do what they could. They didn't really have a choice on anyone they wanted. And so ultimately, I like this roster too. I think that, I don't know if it's going to be a better roster necessarily. I know that their old roster kind of underperformed in terms of their expectations, but their expectations were really high. I mean, let's be fair, with that roster coming into World War II, I mean, they were fully expecting to win events, and they never won one, obviously, and that's ultimately why they broke up. And I think that this roster, it has potential to be better for sure, because, ultimately there was a lot of room to be better on the old Envy roster, but, I don't know. I guess my biggest question marks with this roster are going to be Decimate and Hook, because Hook to me has been maybe the most underwhelming player in World War II up to this point. And I hate to rip into him that hard because it's obviously very difficult to come back from competing in Halo for 2-3 years, where they had advanced movement in Halo as well, and come back to a boots on the ground COD, and that's a big adjustment. And I want to be fair to Hook because that's really tough. And again, another reason why I would say he's underwhelming is because Hook set himself such a high standard back when he was competing in Advanced Warfare. In my mind, I remember watching him and I was like, this dude is the next Scump. I mean, he was just ridiculous in AW, and he really set a high bar for himself. And so I just don't think he's lived up to that bar yet. But again, there's a lot of time left in the World War II season for him to improve. So maybe this is what he needed. Maybe he just needed a change of pace, change of scenery in his team. And I think that that's ultimately what this team's success is going to come down to. I think Decimate and Hook have got to be that strong SMG duo that Temp and Hook were not able to be. And, Ultimately, I think there's real potential for that because I think, Hook probably has a little bit more freedom now. I know Slasher was the in-game leader for the old Envy roster, and he was, pretty tough guy, pretty hard on everyone when they would make mistakes. And I assume with this team, I would say probably the in-game leader would be either Classic or Chino, maybe a little bit of both. And I think obviously those are much more laid-back guys than Slasher, and maybe Hook will have a little bit more, freedom to do what he wants in the game. And ultimately, I think again, Decimate. I really like the signing of Decimate. I think Decimate is a guy that again, he's one of those young gun, largely unproven but really talented guys that I think really could have a big impact. I think he's a guy that I really liked what I saw from him when he was on Arrow's roster, and I think ultimately him and Hook could become a really good SMG duo as well. I think that's ultimately what this team's going to come down to. I think Chino moving him back to the main AR position, I think that's a really good move. I think you know what you're going to get with Chino. Chino's a great player. A lot of intangibles with Chino. He knows how to win. He's already won 2 events in this game. So I really like the pickup of Chino. And then Classic, I think Classic is a guy that's really starting to come into his own at the flex position we've talked about a little bit before. He's a guy that brings a lot of veteran leadership, and I think with Classic and Chino, you largely know what you're going to get. And again, it's going to come down to Decimate and Hook. They've got to become that strong SMG, hyper aggressive, high slang duo that you need to be successful in World War II. But with that said, guys, I'm going to move on to the next roster that was confirmed, and that was United's roster. So United has decided to drop Silly and replace Silly with Felony. Interesting decision. Interesting. Ultimately, I think this does make United a better team. And the reason being is because they needed more hyper sub-aggression alongside of Pristini. I think Pristini and Silly, there were some serious pacing issues there. And I think Felony is a more aggressive sub, and I think that's going to allow him to, bait and switch, trade alongside of Pristini much better than Silly was able to do. So ultimately, I think it's a good pickup. The only thing is, though, with regards to United's old roster with Silly, I don't think that was just a one-man problem. I think Silly was not the only problem. Pristini has been very underwhelming up to this point in World War II as well. And I think he'd probably be the first one to admit that. I mean, I think he's a guy that, again, he set himself a pretty high standard back in IW. And I think that, he's a guy that needs to step up his game for sure. I think he has been, though. I will say that. I think he has been in recent events. He really stepped it up when E United needed to get some wins in order to qualify for Stage 1 playoffs. And I liked what I saw from him. He had flashes at Stage 1 playoffs as well, and I think that ultimately, it's going to come down to, again, this is another team where I think it's going to come down to the subs. I think that it's going to come down to Felony and Pristini, and how can they become that strong SMG duo? We know what we're going to get with Clay and Arcides. We've seen it. Clay is still a top AR in this game in my mind. In most people's minds, he's a guy that just brings so much veteran leadership and experience to the game. He's a great S&D player. And then Arcides has become one of, if not the best flex players in the game. So I think that you know what you're going to get with Clay and Arcides. It's going to come down to Pristini and Felony. They've got to become that strong SMG, in your face at all times duo that you need to be successful in this game. And that's really it. That's really it for United. So with that said, I'm going to move on to Evil Geniuses. This is another interesting one to me. I think that first and foremost, they decided to drop Nameless. Enable decided to go as a free agent, and they decided to pick up Silly and Assault alongside of Aches and Apathy. So ultimately, I like the dropping of Nameless. Nameless has just been very underwhelming as well in this game. He just has not been that high slang main AR that you need in this game. And I really like the pickup of Assault. I think Assault's a guy that a lot of people speculated what they were going to go after once they decided to drop Nameless, which was obviously a good move. Aches has a lot of history with Assault. They've played with each other before. They know their play styles. They get along pretty well as far as I'm aware. So I think that, the pickup of Assault is definitely an upgrade in my mind. I think Assault's a guy it's proven to be, he can be a top AR as well. So I like the pickup of Assault. And then Silly, again, I think Silly is a guy that he brings a lot of intent. He's kind of like a Karma almost. He makes a lot of really smart plays and he makes a lot of big kills. And he's not going to light it up necessarily in the KD category, but he's a very smart player, and he's a very he gets a lot of crucial kills, map in and map out. So I'm very interested to see how he plays alongside of Apathy. Apathy again is another guy that has been, I guess underwhelming is how I'd put it. More so, I'd say inconsistent. He's been very inconsistent in this game, and just hasn't really been able to find his consistency yet in World War II. So ultimately, again, I think this is another team that it's going to come down to the subs, because Assault, I think you largely know what you're going to get with Assault. You're going to get a strong main AR, rather slow player, and Aches has been very good in this game. But Aches has been a very good flex player in this game. And I think that you largely know what you're going to get with Aches. So again, it's going to come down to, Apathy's got to pick up his consistency a little bit, and Silly has got to learn how to really find his role and fit in with this team. And ultimately, I think that's what it's going to come down to. But I do think this does make EG better. They couldn't get a whole lot worse, to be honest. I mean, I know they qualified for the Pro League, but just barely, and then they just completely choked qualifying for Stage 1 playoffs. So, ultimately, I think this does make EG a little bit better. I mean, they needed a change big time. So, ultimately, I think this will make EG a better team. But with that said, guys, I am going to segue over to the divisions update. So, as most of you know, on Tuesday, there was a major update for World War II, and basically, it virtually almost completely overhauled the division system. So the way it works now is you get one tactical and one lethal grenade. So now you can run a stun and a nade. They basically redid all of the divisions as well. So now you get 3 attachments on every gun as opposed to 2. They did a bunch of other stuff. Armored now has flinch reduction. I forget all the actual details, but I played with it some, and I'm sure most of you guys have as well. And the other big thing I want to mention that's a huge positive is the score streak adjustment. So the score streaks have been adjusted. The fighter pilot now costs, I think, like $850, which is huge. I mean, all the score streaks really, I think, got bumped up just a little bit. I think the glide bomb is now 700 as opposed to 650. I think I don't know if the mortar strike changed, but they just basically they did exactly what we said we've wanted for a while now. They made the fighter pilot now the hardest streak to get, which it should have been all along. And now even the glide bomb is a little bit more difficult to get as well. So ultimately, this is a great change because, ultimately, I really do think score streaks have a place in competitive so long as they're balanced. And they just weren't balanced before. They just weren't. I mean, the fighter pilot was the best streak, and it was the easiest to get. It just made no sense. So this change was much needed, much appreciated. I'm very excited to see how this plays out. Now I think we're gonna be in a position where streaks actually do have a place in competitive, and ultimately I think that's a great change that was implemented by Sledgehammer. So props to Sledgehammer for that one. Thanks a lot, guys. Another thing I wanted to touch on, this whole divisions update, before I really get into the meta of it, I think this kind of basically confirms my theory about Condry. So as most of you guys know, Condry was I think this pretty much confirms that he was ousted from his position at Sledgehammer. Him and Glenn Schofield, the two former heads of Sledgehammer Games. I think this basically confirms that they were ousted. Because this is basically a big middle finger to everything Condry established. I mean, there is no chance we would have gotten this update had Condry still have been the head of Sledgehammer Games. There's no way. And I think this basically confirms it. Like I said, I mean, I think that, this basically proves that I think there were some serious creative differences between Condry and maybe others at Sledgehammer, even people at Activision. And it basically just proves that Condry was just unwilling to listen to the community and give us what we want. He was just about how he wanted the game to be how he made it. He didn't care largely about what we wanted as a community, as a player base. And I'm just thank God that they got rid of him, honestly, because again, there is no way we're getting this type of update with Condry still in place. So with that said, I just want to kind of touch on what the update has done so far in terms of the meta. So it really, ultimately, we haven't gotten a whole lot of time with it. We haven't had a major land with it yet, so there's still some speculation as to how this is really going to play out. But ultimately, I do think there are changes that still need to be made. I like the direction they're going. They're allowing more customization, more flexibility for players to kind of pick and choose what they want on their classes, which is ultimately a good thing in my mind. But I do think there are some problems. I think that first and foremost, Armored is essentially a crutch division now. I mean, you basically have to be running Armored, especially in hardpoint. I mean, you're just not going to get away with anything else, really. I mean, Airborne Hunker, you could work, but I mean, ultimately, now that everyone has a stun, you're just going to get stunned into oblivion using that. So, I think that ultimately, I think they need to revert back to just one nade. I think that because the way it is now is, like I said, you have to be running Armored, because Armored is the only one that gives a counter to both a nade and a stun. You can't run any other division. You'd have to pick and choose between Hunker, and I think it's Instincts now, that is essentially Tac Mask. It reduces the effects of stuns. So ultimately, I think they need to first and foremost go back to just one nade. I think the Armored, the Gung-Ho thing is also another big problem. I think Gung-Ho is now on the Airborne class, I believe, and then when you throw on Steady Aim, it just becomes OP. It's ridiculous. So I think Gung-Ho needs to be taken off of Airborne. I think the Armored needs to be... ultimately, I think if you go back to just one nade, I think that is going to help a lot with not making Armored a crutch division, just because ultimately then you free up players to use Airborne and Hunker perhaps. So ultimately, I think that the biggest thing to me is going back to one nade, essentially getting rid of Gung-Ho on Airborne. And then I know I saw the pros. I saw Nameless's first podcast, which is great, by the way. Hats off to Nameless. I love how they're doing that now. Very interesting to see how the pros takes on all this stuff. But they were kind of concerned about, I think they slightly reduced the sprint out speed. Oh, that's another thing I forgot to mention, is that there is now unlimited sprint for every class, which is ultimately, I think, a good thing. It doesn't make it to where Airborne is as much of a crutch as before. So I like the unlimited sprint, but I think they also slightly reduced the speed at which everyone runs in order to account for that. And I don't really see a huge problem with this. I know the pros had voiced some concerns about it. I don't really see a huge problem with it. I think the fact that there is unlimited sprint, allows you. I think it's a fine compensation. I don't think there's a huge difference. I mean, so far from what I've played and what I've saw, I don't think there's a big problem. But maybe something will pop up. I'm very interested to see how this update plays at Seattle next weekend. That's going to be really where we discover what needs to be tweaked, adjusted, fine-tuned in order to make this division update the best it can be. So, ultimately, interested to see how it plays out. I think that I think this is a step in the right direction, but there are things that need to be changed, that need to be fine-tuned for sure. So, interested to see how it goes. Very excited for Seattle. And, lastly, I just wanted to kind of touch on my sort of just housekeeping things. So ultimately, as most of you guys know, Seattle is next week, CWL Seattle. Very excited for it, obviously. Anytime there's a major event, I just get giddy. I just can't wait to just sit on my ass and just watch COD the whole weekend, man. It's just great. So, I think next week's episode will be out on Thursday to account for the tournament. Obviously, I want to give my break down the tournament, break down the pools, all that good stuff as always. With that said, guys, I think that's going to do it for today's episode. Be sure to follow me on Twitter, guys. Like, share this episode if you enjoyed it. Subscribe to me on YouTube and iTunes. Leave us a rating and a review. That always helps us out a lot. Really helps me understand what you guys want, what I need to improve upon. That's always much appreciated. And with that said, guys, that's going to do it. I will see you guys on Thursday.